Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
So I'm Alex Stonehill, UW's Communication Leadership's Head of Creative Strategy, and we're here for a special live Q&A oriented towards our international students, especially those thinking about their plans post-graduation. And our guest today is Tahmina Watson, right here with me. She is an immigration lawyer who's been practicing for about 15 years. I was looking on your website, a little bit in Britain
and then
that's right. In the US. And she's also an outspoken immigration advocate and advisor. She recently founded a nonprofit called Widen Law, Washington Immigrant Defense Network, which combines the skills of immigration and non-immigration lawyers to help indigent detainees. She's hosted a radio show for many years called Tahmina Talks Immigration to bring members of the public up to speed on policy changes around immigration law. And she also is the author of a book called The Startup Visa, which basically advocates, oh, nice.
I bought it today, I remember.
That's great. And if I've got it right, the book essentially sort of advocates for a special visa targeted towards foreign entrepreneurs to be able to come to the United States. So that's where much of her practice is, her clients working on visas and immigrations for people in STEM fields, H-1b visas, things like that, right?
That's right, yeah.
So this felt like a perfect fit. Tahmina and I have known each other for a few years, and this felt like a perfect fit for ComLead, because obviously we're a STEM-oriented program, and we have a lot of international students. About 25 to 30% of our students are international students, and many of them have hopes of, after they graduate from this program, staying in the U.S. To work and more. So for those of you who are tuning in live, I'm going to, we're going to talk a little bit first. I'll ask Tahmina a couple questions, and then we will open the floor for you to ask some questions. And you can either do that by unmuting yourself and just chiming in, or probably easiest is to just pop into that chat box and chat something to us, and then we'll try to field the questions as they come in. And maybe somebody can, just to make sure everything is working, give us a quick chat to let us know that you can hear us, you can see us, and you can successfully interact with us. Somebody, cool, thank you, Agathe. Great, that's one of our students, international student from France. So where should we start? Is there any disclaimers about the things that I don't know what you usually say when you do this stuff.
Oh, yeah, well, this is just informational purposes. There's no client-attorney relationship, but I also want to take a moment to say thank you to Alex. And if you didn't know, not only have you invited me here, but he's also co-hosted some of our radio shows. So if you're interested, you can find our podcast, radio show that turned into a podcast on iTunes, and some of the most recent ones are with Alex. So I hope you enjoy them.
Yeah, great. So to start with, let's just start like really broadly. Do you have any general advice for international students who are looking to continue their careers in the U.S. after they graduate from a program like ours, which is a master's program?
Generic advice. First of all, always maintain your status. And we're going to talk a little bit about that going forward today. But as an international student, you need to know what the rules are about having a student visa so that you can move on to something else in the near future, because you have to go through a lot of immigration paperwork. But they will always, immigration services will always be looking at whether you've maintained status. So if there's one thing you walk away from today's conversation, is know what your status is, what you should do to maintain it, what not to do to lose it, so that you can continue to stay in the US as you desire.
That's great. And I think, as far as while you're a student, at UW, we have a very robust international student services department. And if there are any folks from other universities, most of them will have comparable units that are trying to help students maintain their status while they're students and process all that student visa stuff. But as we talked about before, post-graduation, those services sort of stop and students kind of get dropped off a cliff. So that's really what we want to focus on today.
I think what they should also know is the law is changing so rapidly, and we will talk about some of these changes. But what you do now will be very important in your next stages, because the government will be looking for pay stubs and letters from your employer and so forth. All of these things that you do during your student days will become imperative to document when you get to the stage where I can help you. And so because the laws and policies are changing so frequently, it's very important that you stay in close communication with your legal team here and the international department, because they will hopefully stay up on top of the changes that are coming down quite quickly.
Okay, great. So kind of pivoting a little bit to just start thinking about that post-graduation, those thoughts about work visa. Are there things that students can do to position themselves well to get a work visa sponsor? Are there things that come up when you start helping people through that process that are kind of barriers or red flags other than, you know, lapse status like that?
Very good question. I mean, by the time somebody comes to me, they've already got an employer, or the employer has found them. And so the question is, what happens between the time they've graduated and between they've seen me? So quite generally, when somebody has a student visa here, they get 12 months of work permission. Mm-hmm. It's called optional practical training, so that you can get hands-on training. And it's essentially an internship. And I don't necessarily know how people get their internships, but I understand universities can help, recruiters can help, and generally your friends and colleagues can help you find those positions. And so when somebody comes to me, they've been in that position for at least a good 6 to 8 months, and their positions are coming to an end, the timeline is coming to an end, and so they come to me to see what is the next step. Mm-hmm. And typically the life cycle of an international student is they have a student visa for some amount of time, whether it's 3-4 years to do the degree or longer sometimes, 12 months for the optional practical training, and then if you have a STEM degree, you have an additional 24 months. It used to be 17 months, but while Obama was in office, that 17 months got stretched to 24 months, and they gave with one hand and took away with the other hand, because there are a lot of restrictions that I will talk about in a minute. But you have essentially 3 years of work experience if you are a STEM degree holder. And so there's an interplay between whether you want the H-1b visa right now, or do you want to wait until the STEM visa is over. And right this moment in time, end of February, beginning of March, this is when the H-1b season just sort of takes off, because there's one time in the year that you apply for these visas. And if people didn't know, there are 65,000 visas that are given out to people with a bachelor's degree, and an additional 20,000 visas that are reserved for people who have a master's degree from a US accredited school like UW. And the quota for these visas opens on October 1 every year. It's the beginning of the fiscal year in the United States. And you can apply for a work visa 6 months in advance, and that window opens April 1st. So a bit like the tax season, all immigration lawyers who do this, is sort of like they're not sleeping until April 2nd.
Yeah, so we're lucky to have you today.
Oh, it's just ramping up, but next week would be a different story. But what happens from the student perspective is that there's a lot of documentation that they have to give to the immigration lawyer and their employer. And all the things that you're doing during your student days are the documents that you'll have to give. So don't throw them away, because every single document is going to be very important, like your pay stub. You know, I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily save my pay stubs. Yeah. You know, but when you're a student or on a work visa, you've got to save those, because that's proof that you are maintaining your status. So how does this lottery work? It's actually a lottery because the demand is significantly higher than the supply. For the 85,000 visas that are going to be given out this year, I predict the government may get 250,000 visa applications, and it just means that 1 in 3, 1 in 4 people will get a visa or be selected. And up until this year, what would happen is the 20,000 master's degree holders would be selected first. So USCIS, the United States Immigration and Citizenship Services, they will collect all these 200,000 plus applications. They will enter, each case will get a number, and then their computers will do a random selection process. And it would typically happen with the 20,000 first, and then anybody that wasn't selected in the master's program would automatically drop down to the bachelor's degree program, and then have a second bite of that cherry, so to speak.
Because presumably if they have a master's, they also have a bachelor's.
That's right. That's right. Yes. But this year, because of the new administration's, it's not new anymore, administration's stance on not necessarily being immigrant friendly, but also touting to be merit-based, so to speak.
Sure.
They have the administration, the president signed an executive order called Buy American, Hire American. And in the Hire American portion, it basically said, we want to hire the people with the brightest minds and the highest paid jobs. And what that meant was that executive order trickled down to adjudicators where they're being very restrictive in all of their policies. And what they had done for this year, they're reversing the lottery, which means that everybody's going to be in the bachelor's degree pool first. And the hope is that people with a master's degree, so people who are watching this webinar hopefully have a better chance, they want the master's degree holders to be selected more.
Okay.
And so the bachelor's degree selection will happen first, and then the master's degree selection will happen. And they hope that 16% more master's degree holders will be selected through this reversal.
So that was the announcement that we heard last month or something like that.
That's
there was there would be a higher allocation of H-1Bs for people who had U.S. master's degrees.
Exactly.
So good news for our students.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so we're going to keep going here, but please, if you have questions you want to ask Tahmina on this specific topic or anything more broadly related to post-graduation visa opportunities and immigration, please go ahead and type into the chat box. Here's one right here. Do you have an update on current USCIS processing times? I sent my application packet at the beginning of the month and find it challenging to apply for jobs and talk to employers without a clear idea of when I'll receive my OPT.
Good question. So you're asking about your OPT application. And as an immigration lawyer, I typically don't file those. They're supposed to take about 90 days, but everything is taking significantly longer. So my suggestion would be that you talk to your international department teachers who have filed your application and get a sense of what they're seeing. What you see on the website is not always true. In fact, it's never true. So if it says 4 months, add another 2 months to it. But it's very important you stay in close communication with the international department.
And this speaks to something that we've talked about in the past, that this is not really a terribly user-friendly system, right? It's almost the opposite, which is too bad, because clearly, it's of great benefit to have these opportunities. We have them there for a reason, but it's not necessarily very customer service oriented, is what you find.
And if anything, the tiny little bit of help that we used to get is being curtailed. So they're doing everything in their power to actively not help.
Yeah. Okay. Another question from Aaron. Are you able to apply for H-1b visas when you're currently on OPT?
That's a very good question. And the answer is yes. One of the nuances in this situation you have to think about is if you're on especially if you have a STEM degree, well, two things. If your OPT, let's talk about the 12-month OPT and then the 24-month. Some people's OPTs could expire middle of the year. So you apply for the H-1B April, but your OPT is expiring, let's say, July 2019. There's something called Cap-Exempt. And that means that if you can prove that you apply for an H-1B, your school can extend your OPT from from July, if that's the end date, to September 31st. So the answer is yes, you can apply for H-1B while you're on OPT. And if you have a STEM degree, and you're entitled to the additional 24 months of OPT, then you can continue to apply for OPT, H-1B during that time, because remember, it's a lottery, and you may or may not be selected. Now, the other question that follows from that is, do you have to be on the H-1B even if you get selected? Now, this is something you have to talk to with your potential employer about, as well as understand your own travel circumstances. Some people travel in the summer to go see their families. When you apply for an H-1B, there are two ways of doing it. And when I say two ways, it means every H-1B application or any work visa application has a two-pronged way of being adjudicated. They're looking at the merits of the case. Do you need a degree to do this job? Do you have that degree to do the job? And then they look at the individual. Are you eligible for this visa? Have you overstayed? Have you violated your previous visa rules? Have you traveled while you're asking for a change of status? So they can do both, or they could do one. You can also ask for one. So if you are, there are two things that happen. You can ask to say, hey, I want to change my status to H-1b, and I want to do a seamless transition. And so there's a box on the form saying, please change my status. Now, if you do that, you do not want to travel until that change of status has been approved, because a change of status will then be considered abandoned if you travel. And the second reason for not wanting to change your status is because you have ample time on your STEM degree left. OPT, I mean. And so you may not want to change your H-1b. The H-1b is for a total of 6 years. And if you've been a student in the US, you already know that time flies. And you're coming to the end of your degree, and 4 years have probably flown by. Similarly, H-1b, the 6 years will fly very quickly too. And so some people want to maximize their time, and so they stay on their STEM OPT and then activate the H-1b at a later time. And the way you activate that is to travel outside the country, go to the embassy, get a visa stamp, just like you did for your student visa, and then come back on the H-1b. And that means you've maximized your time on the STEM OPT, and there are sometimes tax benefits to it. As a student, I believe you pay less tax. I don't really know the tax stuff. I'm not a tax lawyer, but I just have been told that there are some benefits. And so those are some of the things to keep in mind. But the answer is yes, you can.
Okay, you can apply for H-1b. And let's jump to some other questions related to H-1bs. How much does it cost for the employer to sponsor an H-1b?
That's a really good question. And in fact, with the Trump administration's negative view on immigration, the costs have increased significantly. And so there is a cost for the USCIS, Immigration Services. It's a fee-based organization, so every time you file a form, there's some money associated with it. And so the form fees are separated into 3 segments. $460 for the form called I-129, $500 for something called a fraud fee, because they have fraud investigators to go and basically see if this is real or not. And there's something called an acquia fee, something that every fee is helping train somebody else. And that goes to the Department of Labor's slush fund, so to speak. And if the employer has less than 26 employees, the fee is $750 per application. And if it's more than that, it's $1,500. So those are the 3 separate fees.
And those are all fees that the employer would be paying, not the applicant.
That's correct. In fact, all of the H-1b fees you want the employer to pay, because then there is assumption of bias, and the form fees must come from the employer's checkbook. And we've had issues where the government assumed it wasn't the employer's checkbook. And so there are some nightmare stories about that. In terms of the attorney fees, somebody like me, but there are lawyers around the country, there's a separate fee for them to process such applications. And they can vary from $3,000 to $5,000. But then there could be additional fees, because these days the government is scrutinizing almost every case, even simple cases, where they're scrutinizing whether a degree is necessary to do this job, whether the employer has enough work for this particular employee, and so forth. And those can cost, on average, I'd say $5,000. So it's not a cheap thing for the employer to do. So they are making an investment in the person that they're sponsoring. And that's why a lot of students will come to me and say, well, I can't find an employer. And which is why the internship is a great way to prove yourself that you're worthy of it.
So, and related to this, I think you sort of answered this question a little bit already. Is the willingness of companies to hire an employee who needs an H-1b directly dependent upon the size of the company? Sounds like they need to have enough resources to be able to do all of this. Is there any other considerations there?
Well, the size of the company dictates the scrutiny, but it doesn't necessarily prevent one from getting a visa. We've done it for startups with just 1 person or 2 people, to multinational companies. So the size is really where the government is scrutinizing. Do you need this person, and do you have enough money to pay this person?
Okay. And it sounds like the pathway you're laying out here is basically that you would do your OPT. Our degree, to dial back a minute, is a STEM degree. I'm sure most of our students know that, but so it qualifies for that 24 months of OPT. So you would use that period as an opportunity to do internships, try to build a relationship, either build your working kind of skill set that could be applicable to other companies, or potentially even do an internship or some kind of OPT work with the company that you hope to be placed with. permanently, or not permanently, but for an H-1b visa, and then kind of start that process.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And one thing I will add to this: when it's a 12-month OPT, you don't necessarily have to get paid. And I would encourage everybody to read the SEVIS rules. I believe ICE has these rules up on their website about when you need to be paid and when you must be paid, or when you don't have to be paid. But the 12 months doesn't necessarily have to be paid. And the trouble is that sometimes it's difficult to prove that you were working. So you've got to make sure that you are keeping track of the records to prove that you are working when you are applying for an H-1b. And we saw this in 2018 particularly, although in 2017 it reared its ugly head. The government was really scrutinizing people's OPT period. And we got questions like, show me every pay stub you had, show me that you were working, show me that you didn't work. Because in a 12-month period, you have a 90-day grace period of not working. But if it's a STEM OPT, I think it's 120 days, and but you still have to be very vigilant about this. And we had RFEs, requests for further evidence, on these cases where the government said, show me that you worked, show me that the money landed in your bank statement. So we had a very difficult time and challenging time providing this documentation, because who's saving their bank statements too? You know, especially if they're a little bit older, you're not necessarily, and if you do online banking, you're not necessarily having access to those statements again. And so for OPT periods, the paperwork, I can't emphasize it enough, it has become very challenging. The other thing that the government is adding, it's a 2018 development, actually. We were getting questions where the government said, well, you're doing OPT and CPT, and it's allowed because universities have gotten permission from USCIS to provide OPT, and then people are doing CPT. People don't know what CPT is. It's curricular practical training, and that is often part of the program that you are studying. And you can do that full-time, and you can do that part-time. And the government is interpreting the rules very differently now, where they're saying if you do full-time CPT and you did full-time OPT, you did not maintain status. Now, if this was 2 years ago, you can't go back in time and fix it anymore. So the reinterpretation of these very established rules, in my opinion, illegal. But they have to be challenged, and the challenges haven't happened yet. So another reason why, if you are doing OPT or CPT or both, keep in close communication with your university team, because you need to know what is the latest development. It's changing almost month by month.
And just for clarity's sake, CPT is when you're an enrolled student, and OPT is after you graduate.
That's correct.
Okay, got it. Okay, so let's see. One more big picture H-1B question. Would you know what kind of companies usually sponsor H-1B visas? I mean, I'm sure you don't know all of them, but you work with a lot of these. What kinds of companies are you seeing, let's say, succeeding?
Well, you know, we do. Other than the obvious ones, where there's Microsoft and Amazon and all of those ones, smaller companies hire H-1B employees too. And often we have companies that have never hired H-1B workers before. So we hold their hands very closely. And, you know, it can be anything. It's whether you need a degree to do that job. So it can go from doctors, lawyers, to various different types of computer-related positions, to communication positions as well. And because this is a communications department, one thing that your students should know is that the communications H-1Bs always have an extra element of scrutiny. Because the government can always argue that you can learn some of these things, you know, through open software. You don't necessarily need to have that degree. And so you really have to push through the barriers of showing that the transcripts of this, you know, I learned communications, I learned, you know, storytelling or economics, and sometimes programming. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into it. It's not just storytelling.
So the syllabus of your classes might become crucial in those.
It actually is crucial. Yeah. In 2000, I've done several of them. And in 2017, we had a PR company that we were helping, and it was a communications position. And it used to be that there was a research analyst type of market research analyst used to be the position that was very popular for communications positions, but then that became a position that was completely poo-pooed by the USCIS, saying you don't need a degree to do it. And then the new code, the Department of Labor has codes for each of these. It's a communications manager. I forget what it is.
Yeah.
We still had the same challenges. So we went to the university and we downloaded the entire syllabus and we explained, you know, this is what they learned, and the academic training that they learned at university is what they're doing in their job. And you have to prove that nexus. And so sometimes curriculums can change, but I would encourage people that if your curriculum is given to you in print, keep it handy. Do not lose it, because when 2 years later, 3 years later, you're applying for this, the curriculum might have changed and you might not have access to those very those little codes of courses that you've done and the explanation that comes with it.
That's interesting. So, and generally speaking, it sounds like things that appear to be technical tend to, you know, in the government's estimation, are more qualified than things that feel like they're more like day to day. Even though, as we know from our comm lead classes, those sometimes the things that seem common sense, there are many layers, and there are ways to approach them more strategically and scientifically that you really do need the education to be able to do well. Okay, thank you. Let's see, thank you everyone for the questions. There's a lot to go through here, so I'll try to go fast. Is it okay to work full time on CPT?
You know, this is a very changing area. What the government is saying is that you can have complete training just for 12 months. And I can't tell you if there's complete clarity on it, but they are questioning if you've done full-time OPT and full-time CPT, they're denying H-1Bs. And so I believe part-time CPT is fine, but if you are thinking about OPT, you've really got to talk to your international department about the CPT. They're also looking at, when did you start your CPT? Did you start it immediately upon starting your course? And so the CPT issue is absolutely a moving target, and I would encourage you to speak very closely with your international department about what those moving targets are. And they're changing as we speak, so there's not a direct answer, yes or no. But I would say that having CPT full time, particularly if you have OPT coming up, would be problematic.
Okay, so be strategic about when and how much you do the CPT.
And you know, in the past it didn't matter. Even 2 years ago, it didn't matter so much. You know, people will say CPT, OPT, we got their I-20s, we could, you know, got the corresponding documents to show. Now in our office, as of last week, we have a new checklist. Because now we have to do our due diligence to see if this H-1B will even be approved. And
so it sounds like this stuff really changes quite a bit from administration to administration. So
only this administration. Past administrations never cared so much because past administrations have valued international students. Past administrations understood that the innovation and the creativity and the economic boost that international students bring. This administration just gives a lot of lip service about merit-based, but in practice it's not doing that.
It's creating a lot of barriers. Let's see. For OPT extension, we can only work for E-verified employers.
That's a really good question.
What are the pros and cons for employers to be E-verified?
That's a really good question, and this question comes up quite often. When you are, and so backtracking to the STEM OPT rules, when immigration reform died in 2013, President Obama had executive orders, executive action on immigration that gave rise to DACA and many other things. And one of them was to change the student visa program so that the 17-month did become 24 months. But at the time, there was litigation saying, well, these student jobs are taking our real jobs away. And so that particular case changed the direction a little bit in which the STEM OPT was going to be, revamped. And so they did elongate it to 24 months, but they put a lot of restrictions in it. And one of them was that you can't be self-employed on a STEM OPT anymore. You must have a training program that stays in the student's file in the international department. They must get paid at the fair market value of what other interns would get. And the other one was the employer must be E-verified. Now, E-verify comes with pros and cons for the employer. They're not doing E-verify just for you. They are now promising to do e-verify procedures for every single person that they recruit in their company. So there are pros and cons, and not all employers want to do it. And so the question that comes to me often is, how can I make my employer do e-verify? And it's something that you have no control over, unfortunately. They either will do it or they won't do it, and you can't push it, because it's not just about you, it's about their entire business at that point.
And I'm sure it's, somewhat burdensome thing to do.
Yeah.
Okay. So I understand that international students can stay 60 days after they've graduated while the OPT is being processed. You mentioned that it's taking longer for processing times. Can we stay in the country if we've not heard from USCIS until our mentioned start date? Are there any steps that we need to take to stay until we hear back?
Typically, if you have a pending application that was filed while you are in status, you can typically stay until that adjudication has happened. But because of all these moving targets, again, it's very, very important to stay in close communication with the people that are helping you with this, because one of the bigger changes that happened recently, and something that you can hear on our podcast with me and Alex, is about changing the view in which unlawful presence for students are being looked at. Any student who is here and finishes their course can have 60 days of grace period. And typically, if people have stayed after that, they haven't been found unlawfully present. There's a difference between not having status and being unlawfully present. It's a technical term, but unlawfully present means that if you have accrued more than 6 months of unlawful presence, you cannot come back to the US for 3 years if you leave the country. And if that unlawful presence becomes 12 months or more, you cannot come back for 10 years, which is why you see this undocumented mess that we're in, unfortunately, with 11 million undocumented people, because they have mixed families, US citizen children. They can't just leave and come back anymore. And what this administration has done, saying if you finished your course or you, let's say, worked unlawfully, we're going to say that you are unlawful from that day that your visa rules have ended. So day 61, not if your application's pending, but if nothing was pending, you are now going to be considered unlawfully present, and that clock is going to start. In the past, it used to be when you file your H-1b or a judge has found you, there has to be a formal process in which the unlawful presence was found. Now it's automatic. And so this question is very important, because you need to stay in close communication with your department and the people helping you, because this is, again, a moving target. If you have the application pending, my opinion is you're still fine. But I don't know these interplays that are happening with this one memo to another memo. The interpretation from the USCIS is absolutely unprecedented. And what I'm saying today may not be true tomorrow. In fact, it's that fast.
So there are the rules as they're written, and those seem to be changing all the time. And then there's the way that those rules are being interpreted and enforced.
Exactly. The interpretation of it is what is crucial, because the way things are being interpreted now have never been interpreted in the way they are now. And they're so detrimental, not just to students, but to schools, to employers, and so forth. So my hope is that there will be some schools who will file lawsuits in the near future, and I think it's a matter of time for that to happen. But it's, again, for students in the mix of this at the moment, keeping on top of the law, keeping on top of what's going on in the school and the policies, is the only way to do that is to stay in close communication with your department.
Okay. Let's see, one semi-related. Can I request a new F1 visa before the expiration date? How early can I request the new one? When I apply for a new F1 visa, do I need to go back to my home country? And then...
Good question.
Yeah, and then there's like...
So just so people know, there's a visa, that's a visa stamp in your passport. That's the indication of your visa. And when you get an I-20, that has a date of how long you can be here. Your student visa, if it expires, in my opinion, you should try to keep it valid, because when you travel outside the country, you cannot come back unless it's valid. And given the times that we're in, it's important. Let's say you jaywalked and some police officer picked you up. They're going to want to know what your status is, and your visa stamp generally is the way to prove it. And so I typically say that go back to your home country to get a visa stamp to come back.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then if my F1 visa expired but I-20 is still active, can I apply for OPT?
The answer typically is yes. Because the visa stamp is not, the I-20 is what's dictating your time to stay here. And everybody, I wish I could say show your hands, but everybody knows what an I-94 is. And the I-94 is any person coming to the US who's not a US citizen or a green card holder will have an entry into the US that's formal, and the government has, the Customs and Border Protection has a website in which they document everybody's entry. And so their passport is swiped, their information is listed, and it tells you how long you can stay here. So the I-94, if you're on a tourist visa, will say you can stay here until January 31st. But if you're a student, it will say D for dog /S, duration of stay. And that means even if your visa stamp has expired, your permission to be here is for as long as you're studying, and therefore your I-120 is dictating how long you're here. And so yes, you can apply for an OPT.
Okay. So my OPT is under process, which I submitted last week. I'm assuming that I will receive my EAD card not until April or May. Can I leave the US in this period after my graduation on March 22nd?
I would advocate that you do not travel, but talk to your department as well, because what happens is you're essentially asking for not so much a change of status, but an extension of status. And these days, even with people who have visas, are having very difficult times with Customs and Border Protection Patrol, sorry. And I advocate, if you have a situation like this, don't travel, because it's more hassle than it's worth. Okay. There's a lot of risk involved.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've gotten through most of the questions, so if anybody has one we missed, feel free to pop it in there again. I'll ask a kind of general question in our last couple minutes here.
Can I ask something?
Please, yeah.
Because a lot of your viewers might be thinking about H-1Bs next year. And next year is going to see a complete revamp of H-1Bs that we've not seen in decades, and especially in my practice time. And so what the government has done through this reversal that I mentioned, that's the one rule that they're implementing, but there are other rules that were essentially passed, and they're implementing it next year. And so next year, there's going to be a pre-registration system. So if you do apply for an H-1B, there's going to be a simple process to say, hey, I want to be in this lottery. And so there'll be that lottery. We think it might be April 1st. We don't know.
And you already need the employer to enter that lottery?
You do need the employer. Because the employer is going to submit it, and then you'll know if you've been selected or not. Once you know that you've been selected, then you file the application. Right now, we file everything at the same time. We prepare for months and months and weeks, and then we file it all, and then they have it. But the timeline is that we start maybe end of December, January in full force, file everything March 31st, and then we sleep for a bit. And then the requests start to come in June or July, and then hopefully people will get their visas by October. That time is taking longer. But what we anticipate next year is H-1Bs are going to maybe stretch around the year, because they're going to give timelines for putting that application for the pre-registration. And then you're going to have a certain timeline in which you must file the application. And so what you need to know is the system is going to be completely revamped. The one thing about this year is if you get selected in the lottery, you're selected in the lottery even if you don't start that job, as long as it's been approved. But what we anticipate, what the rules say next year is, if you have filed your H-1B, you've been selected in the lottery process and your application hasn't been filed, you have to be in the lottery again. So right now, if you've been in the lottery once, you'll assume you're in the lottery next year. You don't have to be in the lottery again. And that's a big, significant change, that you have to look at these rules, know what the timelines are of applying, and make sure you work with your lawyer and your employer very closely to make sure those timelines are maintained. Is there any,
I know you're busy, so you probably don't have an interest in drumming up more clients necessarily, but does anybody do this successfully, especially the H-1B piece of it? Or rather, let me phrase, which pieces of this can you do without a lawyer, if any? And when you recommend, like, okay, it's time to go hire a lawyer?
The trouble is that it's very difficult to do an H-1b without a lawyer. The procedures are very intricate, and just to file a simple form, the information that goes in that apparently simple form takes a lot of time to assess. So if you take the communications position I mentioned, there are 2 different types of codes that could work. And then what they did with the Buy American, Hire American, in which there was one sentence saying we're going to give jobs to the highest paid and the brightest people. So they said the masters. But the highest paid men, they started to scrutinize wage levels. And those wage level of entry level 1 to more experienced level 4. And anybody who filed an H-1b with a level 1 started to see problems, even denials, where they're saying, well, you picked that code because that's a cheaper code. And so while it might appear to be simple, there's nothing simple about it. So it's not recommended that somebody tries to do this, because it's a lot of money that you're putting down the drain, and then you're alerting to the government to, hey, this employer is a bit fishy. And the other thing that's happening with some employers who try to do things by cutting corners are now seeing bigger problems with, there is one case reported in Bellevue, actually, where the employer is in jail. There's another employer in New Jersey where they're alleging fraud. Both of these have fraud allegations and charges. And that person, who is a different nationality, who got US citizenship while doing these applications, is now facing revocation of his citizenship, potentially too. And so there are ramifications that I see in the next 2 years where the H-1B employers' risks are actually higher than they've ever been.
So mistakes can be costly, so you want to make sure that you have everything in a row. And as we were talking before, it's not terribly like, when you make a mistake, you don't necessarily hear about it in a timely manner, or you don't necessarily get like, let's help you fix that mistake. Sometimes it can be viewed in a very adversarial way.
That's right. That's right. And what I say to every one of my clients is that if there's been a breach in your violation of your rules that you knowingly or didn't know you did in the past, you cannot go back in time and fix it. But that problem is going to follow you for the rest of your immigration status here, and potentially curtail your time in the US. And so therefore, at this time, and this is so wonderful that you have so many people paying attention, because this is the time you need to pay attention to your status, because it's going to come and bite you if you don't. So
can you, this has been a lot of potential pitfalls and a lot of challenges. Can you offer us any words of hope for ways that this can work for people? You've seen it work well. Anything?
Well, yes, we're in a difficult time in the US when it comes to immigration. But yes, if you have a master's degree, if the President of the United States, we want people with master's degrees, I think people with master's degrees from a US school actually have a better chance now. If anything, I anticipate H-1Bs to say, well, he just has a bachelor's. I anticipate that coming up in the 2019 trend. So I think those of you here who have master's, I think that's a positive all by itself. But working with your lawyer very closely, making sure your paperwork is correct, I think that gives you a better chance. And making sure that your employer is doing all the things that they're supposed to do. And I always say to my employer clients, well, the government just wants to see that you're doing the boring things that boring employers do. Paying taxes, payroll taxes, your pay stub is actually deducting all the things that it's supposed to deduct, because that's what they're looking at. So yes, you can strengthen your case by making sure that your paperwork is as strong as it can be.
And it sounds like looking for employers, trying to do your OPT and applying for jobs with employers that have done this in the past, right? Because it's
it doesn't necessarily, it does help, but it doesn't necessarily prevent those who've never done it before. I mean, there are, the economy, despite everything, is booming. And every employer I speak with, regardless of the industry they're in, says, I can't find the talent I need. And often it's the international students that are filling the talent that they actually need. So there are lots of startups, newer companies that have been around for several years but have never done this before, that do want to have people with this type of skill set. One thing that you should know is there is an H-1B that's outside the lottery. And that's called Cap-Exempt H-1b. And that's if you work for a university like UW or somewhere else. But if you are working for a nonprofit that has a university affiliation, and that's outside the cap, meaning that you can apply for those H-1Bs anytime. So if anybody's interested, Google Cap-Exempt H-1b to learn more about that.
Anything we didn't cover that you think people should know, or any last questions from the listeners?
There was an article I was reading just to prepare for this, and there is an immigration lawyer who's a professor somewhere on the East Coast, and he has about 50 examples, I understand, of how people can fall out of status without knowing. Like your professor might have said that it's okay to drop one course, so then you have 11 credits instead of 12, but your international department didn't know about it. So one person's giving you permission, but the person who should be giving permission didn't know, but you have inadvertently fallen out of status. What are the ways in which you can inadvertently fall out of status? It's good to do some reading on that, because sometimes you think you're doing fine, but something technical has gone wrong, and never in history has that been more important, because the unlawful presence memo is also saying they can start deporting people, and you don't want to be that person.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Tahmina. We'll be capturing this recording and sharing it on communication leadership channels, and hopefully maybe we can actually include the link to that article you referenced as well, and any other supplementary materials. Tahmina Watson, thank you so much for being with us today. You can find Tahmina at her website, Watson Immigration Law is the name of her firm, and look out for more.
Oh, and this is the book. It's called The Startup Visa. It actually is very helpful for people who want to start their own businesses, and you can find it on Amazon. A lot of people who don't get selected in the lottery often want to fall back on an option that they can sponsor themselves
to start their own business, and that's the kind of
another chat for another time.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Tahmina. Thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you.